Hello friends, today's topic of discussion is film censorship in Lala Rajpat Rai. As we are all aware that film censorship is a very controversial kind of a subject, and during the colonial period we find that the colonial authorities in that sense used film censorship as a device where they wanted to throttle the nationalist aspirations of the masses at that point of time. And we also know that a number of leaders during the national movement, how they also played an important role in terms of propagating the ideals of cinematic liberty as well, and they talked about the ideas that how cinema as a medium of expression should be able to communicate those ideas which are related to the national movement. So these kinds of ideas, they were being in a way talked about at different levels, especially Lala Rajpat Rai talked about the film censorship and how it was very important from the cultural point of view as well, from the point of view of the freedom of speech and expression as well. And we find that he made certain interventions in this regard when such kind of censorship authorities tried to throttle the aspirations of the masses. So in the course of discussion, we largely talk about the film censorship in India, that how over a period of time film censorship evolved, and how British, when they brought out the different acts with regard to film censorship, their main objective was to in a way throttle any kind of democratic aspirations or any kind of revolutionary ideas which were there in the society, because they felt that film as a medium of propaganda would be very difficult to tackle if more and more films they are being made on such kind of themes which are in a way giving some kind of a critique of the colonial government. In the context of the readings, one can refer to Gautam Kaul's Cinema and the Indian Freedom Struggle, then Aruna Vasudev's Liberty and License in Indian Cinema, then Bhaskaran's work which relates to the South India, and he has worked on censorship specifically during the colonial period. So S.T. Bhaskaran has also contributed in that sense. So we find that when we talk about films, when we talk about cinema, we find that how cinema has been talked about in the framework of as a source of historical writings as well, because as new research is being conducted, we find that various kinds of sources they have been incorporated in the history writings. Scholars, they have talked about the personal diaries which have been written, they have talked about the oral sources which have become relevant over a period of time. In that context, cinema as a documented source can also be used in the framework of the historical writings, and because it is very well documented, and it has also been argued that how cinema as a reflection of the society is also there. So when we see the uniqueness of the Indian cinema, we realize that how the evolution of cinema was taking place during the national movement, and during the national movement we find that various movements, especially which were launched in the first half of the 20th century, and how these movements they were in a way related to the evolution of the films as well, because generally it has been argued that Raja Harishchand is the first feature film of India, and it has been recognized as well. And we also find that the first movement in the framework of the all India nature, especially in the context of the Gandhian movements, was the strike and demonstrations against the Rowlatt Act, and how it converted or in a way converged in the non-cooperation movement, and thereafter the civil disobedience and the Quit India movement. So in the course of our discussion, we will try to talk about the various kinds of films which were made at this point of time, how these films they were being censored during this particular period. And we also see that how cinema influences and as well as gets influenced by the socio political realities of that particular period, and the ideals and the ideas and the objectives of the national movement, how they influence some of the Indian filmmakers, and these filmmakers later, when they were being interviewed after the independence of India, they very well realized and talked about that how they were trying to use films to propagate the ideals of the national movement. So when we see that cinema as not only as a media but also as a force which is in a way impacting the society, and how the nationalist aspirations and motives, they are getting reflected in films as well. And we realize that as we are talking about Lala Rajpat Rai, who was instrumental in the framework of talking about the film censorship in the Legislative Assembly, and he also was concerned with the Indian Cinematograph Committee (ICC), which was established by the government, and he made observations regarding that as well. And we find that some of the leaders like Satyamurthy, he was instrumental in terms of using cinema as a means of propaganda in the elections as well. So having this kind of a background with regard to the development of the films and how it is also related to the issue of culture and identity, cinema being an art form, and there is a debate with regard to that, whether cinema is an art form, whether it is just a technology. So it is to be understood that technology operates in cinema, and over a period of time technology has developed as well, but technology itself cannot sustain if it is not to be understood, or it is not to be made in the framework of the art form. And we find that how contribution of Lala Lajpat Rai in that sense has been instrumental as well, because many times it was in a way argued by the filmmakers that they were not getting support from the national leaders. And when you talk about Lala Lajpat Rai, we find that when he was trying to communicate his kinds of ideas, then he was very well concerned that how Westerners, they were being portrayed in the films, and how sense of superiority was being reflected, and they felt that no bad image of the Westerners was to be formed in the framework of the masses in India. And so this was also in a way reflective of some kind of a prejudice which was against the portrayal of the Asiatics in the films which were made by the colonial rulers, or which were in a way being exhibited in India. So we find that how Lala Lajpat Rai, when he talked about the ideas of censorship within the framework of the films, and he raised those issues. But at the same time, that when you talk about his own portrayal, we do not find any worthy biopic on Lala Lajpat Rai. Rather, films which are relating to Bhagat Singh, they in a way talk about Lala Rajpat Rai in that manner. And before coming of the Indian Cinematograph Act in 1918, we find that censorship was in a way arbitrary in nature, and even when this act came, then we find that the kind of concerns which were there in this particular act, they were not in a way keeping in mind the concerns of the Indians. And when this act came into being in 1918, we find that it was in a way designed to ensure proper control of the cinematographic exhibitions and to prevent the presentation to the public of improper or objectionable films. So what was deemed objectionable or what was deemed improper by the colonial authorities, that was given importance in this particular act. And we find that when one is talking about the provisions of the act, then we find that the license was required for the exhibition of films by cinematograph, and provincial governments, they were empowered to make rules for the regulation of the cinematographic exhibitions for securing the public safety and for examining and certifying films suitable for the public exhibition. So these kinds of norms, they were being made, and we find that how the canons of censorship, they were being drawn up keeping in mind the films which were imported from the West. And we find that how the provincial board of film censors, they were established in the 4 port cities of Bombay, Calcutta, Madras and Rangoon. as Burma was a part of the British India at that point of time, to examine films for certification. And later at Lahore we find that a censor board was established in 1927. So British, they wanted to in a way operate the censor boards in all these regions. They had their own ideas with regard to the operation of the censorship, with what was happening with regard to censorship in India, and they were very well concerned that anything which is in a way inimical to the interests of the colonial rule or the British Raj should not be shown to the Indians. And they were also concerned with regard to the portrayal of the white men in the films which were coming from Europe or America. So, and they raised concerns as well that the Indians, they should not see any kind of derogatory image of the whites in these films. And when you talk about the people those who worked on these kinds of ideas, we find that in 1922, when British, they were introducing censorship in the media in general, Lala Rajpat Rai, he supported cinema as an instrument of free expression and sought to exclude it from the censor's purview, as has been argued by Samik Bandyopadhyay. So Samik Bandyopadhyay, who has worked on 1930s 40s cinema, and he has written Contemporary Perception from the 30s, and he has pointed out that how Lala Rajpat Rai was instrumental in terms of understanding the operation of the colonial censorship. And we find that how other scholars, as I told you initially, Gautam Kohl, who has written Cinema and the Indian Freedom Struggle, and he has argued that it was perhaps due to his interest in cinema as a means of passing information, including political education, for which he had given his critical observations. So Gautam Kohl has argued that Lala Rajpat Rai was very well aware that what he was talking about in the Legislative Assembly and the role of cinema in the framework of that, how it can provide a lot of education to the masses. And he also argued, he says that it is our faith that freedom of speech and writing is our birthright. And Lala Rajpat Rai said, in a way communicated this kind of an idea in 1922, and his democratic ideas, they were very well reflected in the Legislative Assembly when he was talking about the censorship concerns with regard to the films. And he also argues that there can be only one limitation to it, and it is this, that by freedom we may not encroach upon the natural rights of others, and we may not do anything against morality. So he also realizes that when one is talking about freedom, then the freedom should not be infinite in that sense. Freedom should have some kind of limitations, and the freedom of others and the natural rights of others, they should also be kept in mind when one is talking about these kinds of aspects. And we also have to see that the issue of morality is also very important, as has been highlighted by Lala Rajpat Rai. And with regard to morality and ethics, one can also argue that they are different in different societies, and one set of ethics and morality may not be applicable to other societies. But we have to when films are being made in one society, so the concern is with the morality and ethics of that particular society only, because when different societies across the world, they have different kinds of value systems, different kinds of morality and ethics, then these kinds of portrayals, they should in a way relate to that particular society only. But we have to also realize that such kind of concerns, they were being raised by other nationalist leaders of that time as well. And many magazines like Abhyudaya, Film India, etc., they were also writing from that point of view during that time. And when we talk about the kind of evolution which was happening in the Indian cinema during that particular time, and how British, they were also being in a way involved in the Indian affairs, because they were the ruling elite. And W.F. Evans, a cinema expert from England, was sent in 1922 to examine the state of cinema in India. and he stated in his report that the existing board of censors were weak and inexperienced. So we realized that the kind of interventions which were being made by the British, they were in a way also saying that the board of censors, they were weak and they were also inexperienced as well. And he also suggested that the higher government control over cinema, that cinema should be controlled more and more by the government. And he also talks about that how the government of India should urge the provincial governments to stiffen up and raise to reasonable efficiency the present censorship, which is largely nominal in nature. And we find that when you talk about these kinds of aspects, and when these kinds of things, they were being in a way communicated in the press, especially in Britain in 1925, and it was being communicated that the majority of the films which are chiefly from America are of sensational and daring murders, crimes and divorces, and on the whole degrade the white women in the eyes of the Indians. So they were concerned with the films which were coming to India and the exhibition of these films, and how the Indians, they were trying to understand the European society or the American society with these films. And the portrayal of white women in a derogatory manner was realized by the colonial censors, because they did not want that Indians should perceive them in a particular fashion. And that is why we also see that they are concerned with the idea of imperial preferences as well, and they wanted that the British films, they should be given preference over other films which are coming from Hollywood and other European countries. And it was being talked about that when you talk about the European, the American films, a number of scenes were concerned with the nudity and the passion, and such kind of concerns, they were being raised in the Legislative Assembly on 21st March 1927 by Ramdas Pantulu. And he argued that the films that come from America, there are a large number of them exhibited all over the empire and the world, contain very many scenes which are calculated to corrupt the morals. So these kinds of concerns, they were being there not only in the Legislative Assembly but in the society as well. And many individuals and organizations, they and newspapers, etc., they raised such kind of concerns as well, because what was happening was not in the framework of what was acceptable in the Indian society. And when you talk about the individuals, we find that V. Ramarao, he referred to the abominable love scene which led to the unfortunate youngsters astray in 1927. So these kinds of concerns, they were being talked about at that point of time, and we find that in the Indian Cinematograph Committee, it was also being established. And Mr. J. Sreer, who was a home member, and he in a way moved a resolution, and in that particular resolution, it was being communicated that this assembly recommends to the Governor General in Council that he be pleased to appoint a committee to examine and report on the system of censorship of cinematograph films in India, and to consider whether it is desirable that any steps should be taken to encourage the exhibition of films produced within the British Empire generally, and the production of Indian films in particular. So this kind of resolution, which was talking about in a way that how a committee was to be established, and how that committee has to examine the various aspects which are related to the films, and the system of censorship of cinematograph films was to be reviewed by this particular committee. And they were also talking within the framework of the British Empire as well as the imperial films, that films which are made in Britain, they should be exhibited more when you tend to compare them with other films which are coming to India, because as we are aware that India was also making films, and these films, they were largely silent in nature at that point of time, because the first talkie comes in 1927 in the world. and India itself produced the first talkie in 1931 with Alamara. So, we realize that British, they were very well aware with regard to the exhibition of the imperial films or the British films in India. And on the other hand, when the committee examined this matter, it had something else to offer with regard to the kind of demand which was made by the colonial rulers in India. And when you talk about Lala Rajpat Rai, that how he was in a way foresighted, the way he was concerned with regard to what was happening in the Indian cinema or the Indian films, and that is how he also he gave a speech in the Central Legislative Council in 1927, and he says that his duty was to enter an emphatic protest against the insidious ways in which the various methods are adopted to thrust the principle of British imperial preferences. And so he in a way questioned that how when a committee is being established and how that committee wanted to in a way thrust the imperial preferences, in the sense that how British films, they will find a market in India, how they are going to be exhibited in India. And this kind of procedure was to be seen as very objectionable by Lala Rajpat Rai, and he criticized this kind of procedure which was being communicated through the press as well. And we find that when you talk about this kind of a resolution which was moved by the colonial rulers, especially the resolution which we talked about by the Home Member who in a way moved this resolution, and this kind of a resolution was criticized by Lala Rajpat Rai, and he says that the objective of this resolution was to practically to afford a kind of protection to the films produced in the British Empire. So, they wanted to provide some kind of protection to the film which was being made in Britain. And when you talk about that how Indian industry did not get any kind of an encouragement by the British, and this was not only true of the film industry, but we find that none of the industries they were being supported by the British, and British did not want that the Indian film industry should also prosper, because if any industry in India is going to prosper, then it will not be better from the British point of view. So, we will talk about these kinds of aspects in our next lecture, when we will talk about further the kind of intervention which was made by Lala Rajpat Rai. Thank you very much.